I've always loved hiking. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the sense of freedom that comes with being in nature. But that day, I realized just how quickly things could go wrong. Started out like any other hike. I had packed my bag the night before, making sure I had water, snacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. The trail I chose was one I had done before, a familiar loop through dense woods, with a steady climb to a hilltop that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. It wasn't too hard, but not too easy either. A perfect hike for a Saturday morning. The weather was great, too. The sun was shining, the air was crisp but not too cold, and there was a slight breeze rustling the leaves. I started at the trailhead just after 8 a.m., when the light was still soft and everything felt peaceful. The first stretch was easy, just a smooth path through tall trees that blocked out the worst of the sun. Birds were chirping, and I could hear the occasional rustle of squirrels darting from tree to tree. I kept a steady pace, not rushing, just enjoying the solitude. I'd hiked solo plenty of times before, and it always felt like a good way to clear my head. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. The thought of getting lost never crossed my mind, not once. I knew this trail. About an hour in, the path started to narrow. The trees grew thicker, and the sounds of wildlife grew louder, as if the forest was coming alive around me. I reached a section where the trail climbed steeply, and I had to use my hands to steady myself against the rocks. I stopped to catch my breath, looking out at the landscape below. From that height, the valley was a patchwork of green fields, winding rivers, and distant hills. It was one of those moments when everything felt perfectly in place. But as I started moving again, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched. I brushed it off, figuring I was just imagining things. The wind picked up, making the trees creak and groan. The path had become steeper, and the rocks beneath my boots were loose, making me take careful steps. The air was growing heavier, and I felt a slight chill creeping up my spine. Still, I told myself it was just the altitude, or maybe I was getting a little tired. I reached a point where the trail forked. I could see the familiar path that would loop back down, but I noticed a smaller, less used trail veering off to the left. My curiosity got the best of me, and against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. It was a narrow path, barely visible under the overgrown brush, but it looked like it led up to the next ridge. Maybe it would give me a better view, I thought. The trail grew even thinner the farther I went, the underbrush thickening and the trees closing in around me. I should have turned back, but I kept going, my curiosity driving me forward. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, like someone was right behind me. I spun around a few times, but the trail was empty, just the same silent woods. The further I walked, the more the trail seemed to disappear. I had to push through brambles and thick ferns, the earth soft and spongy beneath my feet. My phone had no signal, and I couldn't even hear the sounds of wildlife anymore. The forest felt unnaturally quiet, like all the life had suddenly been drained away. I tried to shake off the unease that was creeping in, but it was hard to ignore. By the time I reached the next ridge, I realized I had no idea where I was. The view was stunning, but I couldn't place anything below me. The valley I had been looking at before was nowhere in sight. I pulled out my map, but it didn't help. There were no recognizable landmarks. Panic started to creep in, and my heart began to race. I had strayed too far, and I knew I'd have to backtrack. But when I turned around to retrace my steps, the path I had taken was gone. It was like the woods had swallowed it up. The brambles were thicker now, and the trees seemed closer, more oppressive. I couldn't even see the ridge I had just climbed over. The trail had vanished completely. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I'd just gone off track for a bit, that I would find my way back soon. I decided to go in the opposite direction, hoping to find a way down to where I could recognize something. The deeper I went, the darker it seemed to get. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the sunlight. I pushed through, each step becoming more uncertain. I had been walking for hours, and the terrain was becoming more difficult. I tripped over rocks and thick roots, stumbling more than once. My legs were sore, and my mind was racing. I was losing track of time. I hadn't seen any other hikers in what felt like forever. The silence was suffocating. Even the birds had stopped singing. The only sounds were the distant calls of wind through the trees and the rustling of my own footsteps. Then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard something. A faint sound, like a crackling in the brush. I froze, listening. The sound was moving, coming closer. I felt my pulse quicken. There was something out there. Maybe another hiker? Maybe someone who could help me find my way back? I didn't wait to find out. Panic surged through me, and I took off running, my heart hammering in my chest. I crashed through the underbrush, not caring where I was going, just trying to get away from whatever was out there. The sound of my own breath was deafening, my footsteps a blur as I stumbled over rocks and branches. After what felt like hours, I slowed down, breathless and exhausted. My legs burned, and I could feel the weight of the panic dragging me down. I stopped to catch my breath and took a look around. It was then that I realized something that made my blood run cold. The trees around me had changed. The forest was different. The familiar mix of pines and oaks had given way to a dense thicket of birches. The ground was soft and muddy. I couldn't recognize a single thing anymore. It was like I had been walking in circles, but nothing looked familiar. I had to keep moving. I had no choice. The thought of just sitting down and waiting for help didn't seem like an option anymore. I needed to find a way out. Just as the fear began to settle in again, something caught my eye, a break in the trees. I pushed forward, and within minutes, I came to a small clearing. I paused, looking around, when I saw it, a small cabin. It was old, the wood weathered and covered in moss, but it was a sign of human presence. The door was slightly ajar, and there was smoke rising from a small chimney. Relief washed over me. I was so close to breaking through this nightmare. I didn't even think twice as I approached the cabin. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, my body trembling with exhaustion. The inside was dim, but warm, and I could hear a faint crackling of a fire in the corner. There was no one there, but it didn't matter. I had found shelter. I sat by the fire, catching my breath, the weight of the day crashing down on me. Slowly, as I calmed down, I started to feel something else. Hope. The fire was warm, and I knew I was going to be okay. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds outside. The sun was up, and the forest felt different, more alive. I stepped outside and immediately felt the weight lift off my shoulders. The forest didn't seem so threatening anymore. I followed a stream I found nearby, which led me to a familiar trail. After a couple of hours, I made it back to the main trail and, eventually, to the trailhead where my car was parked. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and my legs ached, but I was safe. As I drove home, I couldn't help but think about the cabin. It had been so out of place, so unexpected. It was like the forest had led me there, just when I needed it most. I still don't know how it was there, but I'll never forget that feeling of finding something familiar in the midst of all that chaos. And I've never taken a new trail since. I stick to the ones I know, because in the woods things can change fast, and the best way to stay safe is to never get too far off track. I've been hiking for hours. The sun was still high in the sky, but I could already feel the day starting to lose its heat. The trail I had chosen was one I'd hiked before, but there was something different about it today. Maybe it was the quiet, too quiet even for the woods. As I walked, the path seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, a winding ribbon of dirt and rocks between the dense trees. The occasional rustle of leaves was the only sound breaking the silence, and even that felt muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I hadn't seen another hiker in a while. In fact, the last person I had passed was back at the trailhead, hours ago. The usual flow of people had been absent today, leaving me with a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. I checked my watch. It was late afternoon, nearing the time when the forest starts to take on that amber hue, signaling the approach of evening. My water bottle was nearly empty, and my stomach had started to growl, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. The planned loop I was following was supposed to take another hour, maybe 2, but something told me I wasn't going to make it that far. The trees around me were thick, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out much of the sky. The trail was getting steeper, and with each step, I felt the weight of my pack pressing more heavily against my shoulders. I paused for a moment to adjust it, trying to ease the discomfort. As I did, I noticed something odd: footprints. They weren't mine. I knew that for sure. They were fresh, too, the edges still sharp in the soft earth. I bent down for a closer look. The size and shape weren't anything out of the ordinary, just regular hiking boots, probably someone else on the trail. But then, as I stood back up, I felt a slight chill run through me. The trail had been so empty earlier. How had someone passed me without me noticing? I shook the thought away, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. The forest has a way of playing tricks on you when you're alone, especially when you're far from the usual crowds. I took a deep breath and kept walking, trying to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. A few more minutes passed before I saw the next sign. A small, makeshift sign nailed to a tree. It was hard to read, scratched and faded from years of exposure. I leaned in closer. It said, "Old Ranger's Lookout, 1.5 miles. I didn't remember that being on the map when I had checked before the hike, but it intrigued me. It wasn't a detour, and it wasn't much of a diversion either. I decided to go ahead and check it out. It might be worth the extra time, and the view from the lookout could be nice. The path leading to the lookout was narrow, overgrown with brush, and seemed to fade in places, forcing me to guess the right direction. I pushed through the underbrush, trying to stay on the trail. The trees were starting to thin out, and the forest floor was more covered in moss than dirt now, softening my steps. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A loud crack, a snap of a twig or branch breaking. It was close, too close. I froze, my heart racing. My mind instantly went to the worst possible scenario. A person out here, maybe someone trying to be sneaky, or worse, someone who might not want me around. I turned quickly, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. I held my breath, listening. For a few seconds, everything was still. The air seemed to thicken with tension, like the forest was waiting for something. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a squirrel or a bird, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way on a hike, but it felt different now, more intense. Something wasn't right, but what could I do? Turn around and head back? That seemed like the safest choice, but then I remembered the sign. The lookout was just a little further. I didn't want to turn back just yet. Maybe I was overreacting. I decided to keep moving forward. The lookout came into view after a few more minutes. It wasn't much, just a small clearing with a wooden platform built a few feet above the ground. The view, however, was incredible. A wide expanse of the valley below, with rolling hills and the distant mountains forming a perfect backdrop. The air was cooler up here, and I took a long, deep breath, feeling the tension begin to melt away. The beauty of the place made everything else seem trivial. I stood there for a while, just soaking it in, before I noticed something odd on the far side of the platform. A small pile of rocks stacked in a pattern, almost as if someone had made a shrine or left a marker. The rocks weren't there by chance. Someone had placed them deliberately. My curiosity piqued. I stepped closer to inspect them. That's when I saw it. Scattered among the rocks were small, weathered objects. A piece of cloth, a broken watch, a torn piece of paper. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave these things here? I knelt down, picking up the torn paper. It was too weathered to make out any writing, but it definitely seemed like something had been scrawled on it once. My stomach flipped. I couldn't explain it, but there was a feeling in my gut telling me to get out of there. Fast. Just as I was about to stand up, I heard it again. The snap of a twig. Only this time it was much closer. I spun around, my pulse quickening. This time there was no mistaking it. There was someone out there. I quickly stood up, my hands trembling. The person was somewhere in the trees, but I couldn't see them. The sound was too muffled, like whoever it was moving quietly, deliberately. I turned and ran, without thinking, without hesitation. The forest seemed to close in around me as I sprinted down the narrow path, the underbrush slapping at my legs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The air was thick, and my breath was ragged as I tried to push my body harder, faster. My heart was pounding in my ears. I could hear the sound of footsteps now, behind me, keeping pace with my own. The trail was twisting and winding, but it didn't matter. I had to get out of here. I didn't know how far I ran or for how long, but eventually, I burst out of the trees and onto the main trail. The forest opened up into a wide, flat stretch of ground, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I stopped. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. I was alone. The footsteps were gone. The sound of rustling leaves had faded into the distance. But the feeling, the overwhelming sensation that I had just narrowly escaped something, remained. I stood there for a long while, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, but I couldn't find an explanation. I finally turned and started walking again, this time with a renewed sense of urgency. The trail was much easier to follow now, and within an hour, I reached the trailhead. There were a few hikers there, chatting and laughing, oblivious to what I'd just been through. But I wasn't about to share my experience with them. Not yet, maybe never. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I kept my head down, eyes scanning the woods around me, but I never saw anything out of place. When I finally reached my car, I breathed a sigh of relief. The familiar sight of it, parked in the lot, felt like safety. I got in, started the engine, and drove away. But as I passed the last stretch of the forest, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The woods were still, as quiet as they had been when I first started. But now they seemed darker, more menacing, like something was waiting just beyond the trees, watching, waiting for the next hiker to wander too far. I knew that feeling would stay with me for a long time, and no matter how many times I hiked that trail again, I'd never forget the eerie quiet that had settled over the woods, or the feeling of being followed when I knew I was alone. I'd been hiking for hours, the path winding through the dense woods like a serpentine ribbon, the cool air of early autumn crisp against my skin. The trail had started off easy enough. The forest was peaceful, and I lost myself in the rhythmic sound of my boots crunching on the dry leaves, the occasional bird call piercing the silence. It was just supposed to be a normal solo hike, a few hours of solitude, clearing my head. But what I didn't know was that this hike would take me somewhere I never expected. The first part of the hike was familiar. I had done it a few times before, but today I decided to take a different route at the fork in the trail, one I hadn't explored before. The path was narrower and seemed a little overgrown, but it didn't look impassable. The trees were taller here, the canopy thick, their shadows casting long, deep pools of darkness on the trail. I wasn't worried. The sun would still be up for a while, and I wasn't that far from the main trail. I kept walking, my steps muffled by the soft earth underfoot. The leaves of the trees rustled in the wind, and a distant stream gurgled, making its way somewhere unseen. My mind wandered as it often did when I hiked. Thoughts of work, of my life back home, of things I had to do. My pace quickened as I tried to push these distractions away. The air smelled damp, the kind of scent that comes right before rain. I liked it. It reminded me that the world was alive, that I was part of it. After about an hour, I noticed that the trail was getting less and less distinct. The overgrown brush was now almost swallowing the path whole. I had to step carefully, avoiding rocks and fallen branches that littered the ground. My feet occasionally slipped on the wet patches of moss, and I had to be mindful not to trip. I figured I was still on the right path, though the increasing quiet around me made me a bit uneasy. The farther I went, the more I felt the forest closing in around me. The trees grew thicker, the canopy higher, and the shadows deeper. There was no longer any sound of birds. The breeze had stopped, felt oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. My gut told me something was off, but I pushed it aside. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Then I heard it. First, it was so faint that I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it at all. A rustling, like someone or something was moving just off the trail. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I listened intently, but the rustling had stopped. My hand instinctively reached for the small knife in my backpack, but I hesitated. There was nothing to be afraid of, right? I shrugged it off and continued walking, my steps a bit quicker now, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The forest felt still in a way that wasn't natural. The trees didn't seem to sway in the breeze anymore. They stood like silent sentinels, unmoving, their branches heavy and dark above me. I tried to shake off the creeping sensation of unease, focusing on the ground ahead of me. After another half hour, I came to a clearing. It was a small, almost unnatural space in the middle of the woods. The ground was covered in thick, damp grass, and the trees around it seemed to lean inward, as though enclosing it. There was a large rock at the center of the clearing, smooth and rounded, almost like a bench. I sat down on the rock, taking a break and sipping from my water bottle. It was then that I saw it. A flash of movement from the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but saw nothing, just trees. A shiver ran down my spine. I stood up, my heart beginning to pound in my chest, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a deer or a squirrel. I walked to the edge of the clearing, my eyes scanning the forest around me. The world felt eerily quiet. I took a deep breath and decided to turn back. This had all been a little too much for me, but as I retraced my steps, I realized something strange. The trail didn't look the same. The trees seemed different, the shapes of the branches unfamiliar. The path that had once been clear was now twisted, almost like I was walking in circles. I felt that gut-wrenching feeling again, the one that told me something was wrong. I kept walking, but the sense of disorientation grew. It felt as though the woods were changing around me. The trail, which had been clear and straightforward at the beginning, was now a labyrinth of overgrown paths. The trees seemed to loom closer, the shadows darker. I turned around again and again, trying to retrace my steps, but it felt like the forest was actively pushing me in the wrong direction. The rustling noise was back, louder now. It was too distinct this time, too purposeful. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, and I swiveled my head to look around. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw a shadow moving, too large to be an animal, too deliberate to be the wind. It ducked behind a tree as soon as I caught sight of it. Panic surged through me. I didn't know who or what it was, but I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and started to run. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, and I tripped several times, stumbling over roots and rocks. My breath came in ragged gasps, my muscles screaming from the exertion. But I didn't stop. I had to get back to the main trail. I had to get out of the woods. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were growing thicker, the shadows longer, and the sounds of the woods, those little sounds that should have been calming, became deafening. Every snap of a twig felt like someone was right behind me. I didn't look back, couldn't. I had no idea what was chasing me, or if it was even real, but I couldn't stop. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to slow down, but I kept pushing forward, ignoring the ache in my chest and the cramp in my leg. Finally, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I broke through the trees and onto the main trail. I could see the sign for the park entrance in the distance, and a rush of relief flooded through me. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I was close. I forced myself to slow down, my breathing still ragged. My eyes scanned the trees behind me, but there was nothing. The rustling had stopped. The silence of the forest had returned. The world was quiet again. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I made my way back to the entrance, my steps quick, but my mind still racing. When I reached the park entrance, I felt the weight lift from my chest. The sun was beginning to set, and the parking lot was nearly empty, the car lights flickering in the fading light. I didn't look back as I got into my car. As I drove away, I glanced at the woods one last time through the rearview mirror. The trees stood there, still and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I would never hike that trail again. I had been hiking alone for a couple of days, far away from the city noise, the kind of quiet you can only get in deep forests or mountains, where the only sound is the wind brushing against the trees or the crunch of rocks underfoot. I was in the middle of nowhere, my destination being a secluded lake known for its tranquility and beauty. I had read about it online, and it seemed like the perfect place for solitude. The trail I was on wasn't an easy one. It was rugged, twisting, and uneven, cut through dense woods that made me feel isolated, like the world beyond these trees didn't even exist. I didn't mind, though. Hiking alone was something I enjoyed. The challenge, the connection to nature, and the peace it brought were all things I needed at the time. I had left my phone off, wanting nothing but the sounds of nature to keep me company. The first couple of days were perfect. The weather was cool, the sky was clear, and I found a few nice spots to set up camp. At night, I would sit around the campfire, staring at the stars, thinking about everything and nothing at all. It was the kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. But by the third day, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint right away, just a strange sense that something wasn't right. I shrugged it off at first, just my imagination, or maybe the isolation starting to get to me. That morning, I had packed up and decided to push further along the trail. The lake was supposed to be just a few hours ahead, and I was eager to reach it. As I walked, the trail became more difficult. The terrain was steeper, the rocks sharper, and the trees grew thicker, blocking out the sunlight. The air felt cooler, a bit damp, as if rain might be on the way. But there were no signs of storms, just a heavy feeling in the air that I couldn't shake. Around noon, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led down into a valley, and the other seemed to climb higher up into the mountains. According to my map, both paths would eventually meet again on the other side of the valley, but one would take me longer. The path to the valley seemed easier, so I decided to take it. The trail down was steep, and the rocks underfoot were loose. I had to be careful with every step, but after a while, the trail flattened out, and I was in a small, narrow valley surrounded by thick trees and cliffs. It was eerily quiet. I couldn't hear any birds or animals, not even the wind rustling through the leaves. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no signs of human activity. No footprints, no litter, nothing that indicated anyone had passed through this area recently. The path had clearly been used in the past, but it looked abandoned now. I felt a chill run down my spine, but again, I dismissed it. Maybe I was just too tired, too focused on reaching the lake. As I pressed on, the valley began to narrow. The trees grew even thicker, and the path became harder to follow. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no logical reason for it, but I had this nagging feeling that something was wrong. I stopped for a moment to gather my bearings. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely noticeable at first. A rustling, like someone or something moving through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around but saw nothing. I was alone. I reminded myself that it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a small creature in the underbrush. But the rustling continued. And then I heard something else. A snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. My gut twisted. Someone else was out here. I wasn't sure if they were behind me or ahead, but I had to keep moving. I decided to take a different route, veering off the main trail and heading toward the creek I'd noticed earlier. It seemed like a safer option, a place where I could find water and possibly a good place to camp for the night. But the moment I stepped off the trail, I felt a sense of being watched. My skin prickled. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I picked up the pace, moving faster toward the creek, my breath becoming shallow. I hadn't even noticed how tense I'd become until I heard the rustling again. Closer this time. I spun around, my eyes scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, following me. I reached the creek and stopped to catch my breath. The sound of rushing water was soothing, but it did little to calm my nerves. I decided to set up camp here for the night. The sun was almost gone, and I needed to rest. As I gathered wood for a fire, I felt an overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder. Something was moving in the trees, and it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too quiet. I froze. My mind raced, but I couldn't come up with any rational explanation for the unease settling in my stomach. I finished building the fire quickly, and as the flames flickered to life, I made sure to keep the light around me. But the sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, was still there. The rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Whoever or whatever was out there had been moving closer. I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed up my things as quietly as possible and decided to head back to the fork in the trail. The sun had almost set, and I knew I had to move quickly if I didn't want to be stuck out there in the dark. As I turned to leave, I heard a loud crack, a branch breaking directly behind me. My heart raced. I turned around, but there was no one, just trees, shadows, and the noise of the creek. I didn't know if it was a person or just my mind playing tricks, but I didn't wait to find out. I sprinted back down the narrow valley, the sound of footsteps behind me growing louder. Panic surged through me as I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with exhaustion. Every few seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder, but there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, always just out of sight. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows growing darker as the light faded. I didn't stop to catch my breath, didn't slow down, just kept moving. I had to get out of there. Finally, I reached the fork in the trail. I didn't hesitate. I took the higher path, climbing up into the mountains. The rougher terrain would slow anyone down who was following me, and I needed the head start. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but my legs felt like they were going to give out. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every crack of a branch or rustle in the trees made my pulse spike. I climbed for what felt like hours, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the landscape. But eventually, I reached the top of the ridge. And when I looked back, I saw nothing. No one was there. The footsteps had stopped. I didn't relax immediately. The anxiety that had built up in me was hard to shake. I checked the area around me for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No more rustling, no more sounds of footsteps, just the wind and the distant sounds of wildlife. I knew I had to get back to civilization, to the safety of the main trail. But something had shifted in me. The sense of unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, had been out there with me. But in the end, I made it through. I returned to the main trail at dawn, exhausted but relieved. The strange feeling I had in the valley slowly faded, and by the time I made it back to the trailhead, I could breathe again. I don't know what happened out there that night. Was it someone else on the trail, or just the isolation playing tricks on me? I'll never know for sure, but I can say this: I don't hike alone anymore. Not in places like that. Sometimes some things are better left unknown. It was the kind of day that you'd normally call perfect for a hike. The sun was shining bright in the clear blue sky, but there was a crispness in the air, the kind that you get in early autumn when the leaves start to turn. I had been planning this hike for weeks, ever since I'd seen a post about a trail not far from my town, one that wound through a forest of oak and pine trees before finally opening up to a stunning view at the top of a hill. It was an easy to moderate trail, or so it seemed. I'd done my fair share of hiking over the years, but this time, I wanted something that would push me a bit, something more remote than the usual parks I frequented. I made sure to pack all the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my phone for pictures and emergency calls. I told myself that I wasn't being reckless. I knew my limits and always made sure to stay safe. I started early in the morning, hoping to avoid crowds. As I arrived at the trailhead, the forest was still and quiet, except for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, which reminded me of the camping trips I used to take as a kid with my family. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the backpack settle against my shoulders, and started on my way. The trail was well maintained at first, a dirt path with occasional rocks that made me slow down. The woods around me were thick, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I was completely alone, which felt both peaceful and a little eerie at the same time. There was no one else around, and I liked it that way, just me and the forest, alone in my thoughts. I'd been hiking for over an hour when the path began to narrow. The trees closed in around me, and the air felt cooler. A sense of unease started to settle in my stomach, but I brushed it off as nothing more than the solitude. I'd read that this part of the trail was a bit wilder, more untamed. Still, there was something about it that felt different. I could feel my footsteps echoing in the quiet, and it seemed like the further I went, the less I could hear anything else. The usual chirping of birds had faded away, and the rustling of animals was completely absent. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail. The map I had downloaded on my phone wasn't entirely clear about where to go from here. One path looked overgrown and barely used, while the other seemed to lead deeper into the woods. I paused, looking at both options. I chose the overgrown path, thinking it would be a more interesting route and maybe a little less traveled. The path was harder to follow now. There were thick vines and roots that made walking tricky, and the trail had all but disappeared in places. It felt like I was cutting my own way through the wilderness. My feet were starting to ache from the uneven ground, but I pressed on. The farther I went, the stranger things seemed. The trees were older here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if they'd been standing for centuries. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. As I rounded a bend, something caught my eye. It was just a flash at first, like the quick movement of something large. I stopped and looked around, trying to pinpoint what it had been. There was nothing. I took a few steps forward, but the feeling that something was off didn't go away. It was like being watched. I tried to ignore it and continued walking, though I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often. I figured I was just being paranoid. Hiking alone could do that to you sometimes, make you feel like you're the only one in the world, even when you're not. But the strange sensation lingered. My pace slowed, and my instincts started kicking in. I felt like I was being guided deeper into the woods, even though I hadn't planned to go any further. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip behind the trees. The woods darkened, and the air grew cold. I realized with a jolt that I hadn't checked my phone in a while. I pulled it out, hoping to get a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no Wi-Fi, just an empty screen. The sudden loss of connection made my heart race. I'd read about people getting lost in these woods. The thought of it unsettled me. I looked around, and it hit me that I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. I felt a knot form in my stomach. How had I gotten this far off track? I retraced my steps, trying to find a familiar landmark, but the woods had become disorienting. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't even hear the distant sound of a creak or wind like I had before. It was just still, too still. The night was coming fast now, and I realized that I needed to find shelter before it got completely dark. I decided to set up camp in the little clearing I had stumbled into, thinking I could gather my thoughts and wait for morning. I started a small fire with the matches I'd brought. As the flames flickered to life, I felt a little relief. The crackling sound of the fire and the warmth it gave off was comforting, but the eerie feeling never quite went away. I tried to sleep, but every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves outside the circle of light felt like something was moving just beyond my sight. I lay there in the darkness, wide awake, staring at the glowing embers. My mind raced, thinking about how I had ended up in this situation. How did I miss the signs? I was experienced enough to know better. Around midnight, I was jolted upright by a loud crack of a branch snapping. My heart leapt into my throat. Something was out there. My mind went through a dozen possibilities, all of them bad. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around, scanning the edges of the clearing. There was nothing, only shadows and the remnants of the firelight casting long, distorted shapes on the ground. I stayed up the rest of the night, my back pressed against the trunk of a tree, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. I was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every sound made me tense, and every movement in the woods felt like it was drawing closer. I kept thinking I saw figures moving in the corner of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. When morning came, it was hard to tell if the sun had ever fully risen. The forest was still shrouded in thick, low fog. I felt a small pang of hope as the light grew brighter, but the relief was short-lived. I knew I needed to find my way back, but everything looked different now. The trail, if it even existed anymore, was long gone. The trees were closing in again, and the dense fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I walked and walked and walked, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling deeper in my bones. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was starting to panic. The days of hiking experience that I'd relied on didn't seem to matter in this situation. I could feel the loss of direction creeping in, and I knew I was wasting time by continuing to walk aimlessly. Then, in the distance, I saw something, a faint trail marker, hidden behind a thicket of brush. My heart skipped. I made my way toward it, forcing my legs to push through the thick underbrush. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The trail was still there, though overgrown. The marker was just a faded piece of tape tied to a branch, but it was enough. It felt like an eternity, but I followed the markers until the trail began to widen again. The woods gradually started to thin out, and the fog began to clear. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the sun was low in the sky. I couldn't help but breathe a huge sigh of relief. I found myself back at the trailhead, where my car was parked, the familiar sight of the gravel road offering a sense of safety I hadn't realized I was missing. I was tired, sore, and filthy, but I was out. I had made it. As I sat in my car, my heart still racing, I thought about how close I had come to losing my bearings completely. I had been careless in taking that less traveled path, ignoring my instincts when they told me something wasn't right. But I had learned my lesson. Never take chances like that again. I drove home, still shaken, but knowing I'd made it out. The woods, with all their beauty, had been far more treacherous than I'd imagined. The next time I hiked, I would take a much more cautious route. No more overgrown paths, no more wandering off the trail. And I would never again underestimate the power of silence in the woods. Because silence, I'd learned, can hide things you never want to see. It was early autumn, and I had decided to take a solo hiking trip through a trail I'd heard about for a while. The weather was perfect, crisp air, clear skies, and the sun barely peeking over the mountain ridges as I set off. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. I had hiked for years, and this was just another trip to unwind and clear my mind. But as the hours passed, I realized this hike would be anything but ordinary. I left the trailhead early in the morning. There were a few other cars in the parking lot when I arrived, but it was still peaceful and quiet, just how I liked it. I didn't need company on these kinds of trips. The solitude was what I was after. The trail was marked clearly at first, winding through thick forests of pine and aspen. The leaves crunched underfoot, and every so often, I'd stop to take a deep breath of the cool, crisp mountain air. Around midday, I reached a point on the trail where it began to narrow. The dense trees around me closed in, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to echo in the quiet woods. It wasn't quite eerie, but something about the stillness started to feel off. I shrugged it off as nothing more than an overactive imagination, but I began to pay more attention to my surroundings. The way the branches rustled in the wind, the sharp creak of a tree bending just out of view. It felt like something was watching, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I paused for a moment to take a drink from my water bottle and eat a snack. The path ahead seemed to go on forever, and I knew I still had a long way to go before reaching the summit. I was on my own, with no one else in sight, but it wasn't until I started to hike again that I realized just how quiet everything had become. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There was a signpost ahead, but it was different from the usual trail markers. This one was old, worn, and partially obscured by a patch of thick ivy. It was a simple wooden post with faded paint and no indication of the trail name. The strange thing was that it pointed off the main path toward a thick thicket of trees. I almost passed it by, but something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity or maybe just the pull of the unknown, but I felt an odd compulsion to go down that path. I decided to follow it. The moment I stepped off the main trail, everything felt different. The air was cooler, the forest denser, and the trail beneath my boots seemed softer, as if it hadn't been used in years. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I kept going, telling myself I'd turn back if it got too strange. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees became closer together, and the light dimmed as the canopy thickened above me. I passed an old, rotting log, and as I stepped over it, I noticed something odd. Scattered around the log were a few broken branches, but not just any branches. These were fresh, recently snapped, and some had small drops of what looked like mud or dried sap on them. It didn't sit well with me. This place didn't feel natural. I kept walking, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The trail was barely visible now, overgrown with tall grass and thorny bushes. The silence was deafening, only the occasional rustle of leaves from the wind. I thought about turning back, but the thought of retracing my steps in that eerie, thick forest was just as unsettling as pressing forward. After what felt like hours of walking, I came across a clearing. The trees opened up to reveal a small, weathered cabin sitting on the edge of a stream. It looked abandoned, like it had been there for decades. The roof was sagging, the windows broken, and the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The air around it felt colder than before, and I found myself standing frozen, staring at the cabin. Something in me screamed to turn around, to leave, but my legs didn't move. I felt drawn to it like it was calling me. Against my better judgment, I approached. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound loud in the otherwise quiet air. Inside, it was empty, except for the remnants of an old wood stove, a few broken chairs, and what appeared to be a pile of forgotten personal items. I stepped further inside, feeling the cold floor beneath my boots. I don't know what it was, but something about the place didn't sit right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew it was time to leave. But as I turned to go, I noticed something odd on the floor. A small, crumpled piece of paper, yellowed with age, caught my eye. I bent down and picked it up, half expecting it to crumble in my hands. But it didn't. The paper was surprisingly sturdy for its age. On it were scribbled words, letters hastily scrawled, almost frantic, as if someone had written them in a hurry. The words read, "Don't follow the trail past the cabin. There's something out there. It's watching." I froze. My pulse quickened, and I suddenly felt a wave of panic. I had no idea who had left the note or how long it had been there, but the fear in those words was palpable. I looked around the cabin once more, my breath catching in my throat. The place felt alive with something unnatural. I dropped the paper, turned, and bolted out the door. My heart pounded as I ran, pushing my way through the dense forest, back toward the main trail. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just read. Who had left that note? Was I in danger? The forest seemed even quieter than before, and the further I ran, the more I became aware of how strange everything felt. I didn't look back until I reached the main trail, my legs burning from the sprint. I paused for a moment to catch my breath, looking around. The trail was still there, just as it had been before, and the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. With a deep breath, I began walking back to the parking lot, never once looking back at the dark forest I had just fled. By the time I reached my car, the sky had darkened completely, and I was more than ready to leave the unsettling wilderness behind. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that day. No one would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit that place again. But one thing was for sure, there was something out there, something in that forest, and I wouldn't be going back. It was supposed to be a peaceful day hike. Just me, my backpack, and the promise of some fresh mountain air. I had heard about this trail for a while, and with the weekend finally here, I figured it was the perfect chance to get out of the city and into nature. I wasn't expecting anything too intense, just a good workout and a bit of time to myself, away from the noise of the daily grind. The trailhead was quiet, nestled in the woods, with the kind of stillness you can only find at the edge of civilization. I checked my gear one last time before setting off, making sure my water bottle was full and my phone was charged. Not that I thought I'd need the phone, but it was good to have just in case. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor as I began walking, the sounds of the city gradually fading behind me. The trail was easy to follow at first. It was wide, well-maintained, with a few scattered rocks and tree roots that made the ground uneven. I passed by a couple of other hikers in the first half hour, their faces friendly but distant, everyone lost in their own thoughts. I nodded, but didn't stop to talk. Felt nice to be out here, just walking, breathing in the crisp air. The further I went, though, the more isolated it became. The trail narrowed, and the forest around me seemed to thicken. The sounds of the birds overhead started to fade, replaced by the constant rustling of leaves in the wind. There were no other hikers now, and the silence was a little unsettling. It wasn't the peaceful, quiet kind of silence I was used to, but something heavier, like the air was holding its breath. I kept walking. I wasn't worried yet. The trail had been marked on the map, and I knew the general direction I needed to go. There was no reason to be scared, right? But then I noticed something strange. At first, it was just a flicker out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the trees. I thought it was probably a deer or some other animal, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. The woods were as still as ever. I paused for a moment, listening. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the branches above. I shrugged it off, but the unease didn't leave me. The feeling of being watched lingered, creeping at the back of my mind. I picked up my pace a little, trying to shake it off. It was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard something, a twig snapping off in the distance. I froze. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect from an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked around, trying to pinpoint where it had come from. There were no other hikers around, no sign of anyone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another hiker on a different part of the trail. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But the feeling of being watched, of something or someone out there, wouldn't go away. I kept moving forward, my steps quicker now, almost forced. The sun was still up, but the air had started to cool, and the trees had grown denser, casting shadows that seemed to stretch out just a little too long. The trail dipped down into a ravine, and as I descended, the uneasy feeling in my stomach only grew stronger. That's when I saw it. A figure standing on the edge of the trail ahead of me, just at the bend. The person was barely visible through the thick trees, and for a second, I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light. But as I drew closer, I could see them more clearly. A man, standing completely still, staring straight ahead, not moving at all. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped, instinctively taking a step back, trying to make myself smaller, out of sight. There was something wrong about the way he stood there. He wasn't hiking, wasn't even paying attention to his surroundings. It was as though he was waiting for something, or someone. The hair on my arms stood up. This wasn't right. I held my breath, trying to decide what to do. I could turn around and head back, but that felt like the coward's way out. I didn't want to panic, but every instinct in me screamed that something was off. I considered calling out, but that felt like an invitation. I didn't know this person. I didn't know what he wanted. I decided to keep walking, hoping he would move, that maybe he was just lost or taking a break. But as I got closer, he didn't budge. It was like he didn't even notice me. I was just a few feet away from him when I saw it. His eyes, they were wide open, but his pupils were dilated, like he wasn't seeing anything at all. There was a glazed, almost vacant expression on his face, like he was in some kind of trance. I couldn't take it anymore. My feet moved on their own, and I turned quickly, hurrying past him, keeping my eyes on the ground, not daring to look up. I didn't care if I looked foolish. I just wanted to get away. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I didn't dare glance back. The trail started to twist, and I pushed myself harder, faster, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to distance myself from the figure. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I stopped. My legs were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around and looked behind me, trying to catch my breath. There was no one there. I felt a wave of relief flood through me, though I knew better than to trust it. I'd been hiking long enough to know that fear could make you see things that weren't there. I was probably just imagining things, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. It had only grown stronger. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself, and forced myself to keep moving. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the trees pressing in around me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. By the time I reached the summit, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley below. It was beautiful in a way, but also a little eerie. I sat down on a large rock, trying to take in the view, but my mind was still racing. The air was cooler now, and I knew I needed to head back before it got dark. The trail would be harder to navigate in the dark, and I didn't want to take any chances. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were closer. I didn't have time to think. I jumped up and started to run, my legs burning as I sprinted down the trail. The path was steeper now, the rocks and roots threatening to trip me, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. The footsteps kept following, quick and deliberate, just a few paces behind me. I could hear them getting closer, the sound of heavy breathing in the air. I wasn't alone anymore. Finally, I reached the bottom of the ravine, and as I made my way back up the other side, I saw something in the distance. A group of people, maybe hikers, coming down the trail. They were too far away to see clearly, but I didn't care. I shouted for help, not caring how frantic I sounded, and waved my arms. The footsteps behind me stopped. I didn't hear them anymore. When the group of hikers finally caught up to me, I was nearly out of breath. I explained what had happened, though I'm sure I sounded like I was rambling. They seemed confused, but assured me they hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. We walked back together, and I never saw the man again. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sky was dark, and the parking lot was almost empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something, though I couldn't explain what. Maybe it was just a weird encounter. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But when I got into my car and looked out the window one last time, I saw something in the distance, a shadow standing by the trees, just watching. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I slammed the car door shut, started the engine, and drove away, not looking back. And I never went hiking alone again. It had started like any other hiking trip I had done before. I was no stranger to the outdoors, and a few days out in the wild had always been a perfect way to unwind. This time I had chosen a new trail, one that wasn't as popular as the others, which appealed to me. I wasn't into the busy routes that drew crowds of people. I preferred the quiet, remote places where I could get away from everything. This one had a reputation for being a little rough, but I was used to that. The trail was tucked in the mountains, a stretch of old woods that hadn't seen much development. It was perfect. The weather was crisp, the air smelled fresh, and the sun was high but not too hot, which made the walk comfortable at first. The leaves were starting to change color, with hints of orange and yellow filling the trees. I set out early in the morning, knowing I had plenty of daylight ahead. The first few miles were easy enough, just a gentle ascent that didn't push me too hard. As I walked, I kept to the trail, admiring the surroundings. The trees were dense, and the ground was soft beneath my boots, with a carpet of fallen leaves and moss. I had a sense of peace, the kind that only nature could give me. I found myself smiling at the beauty of it all, the only sounds being my footsteps and the occasional call of a bird. But then, things started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The trail was getting steeper, and the trees seemed to grow denser, blocking out more sunlight. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, Nothing. I could feel the temperature drop a little, and a chill crept down my spine. I paused for a moment to take a drink of water and check my map. I was still on the right track, or so I thought. I had made sure to study the route beforehand. But as I stood there, I noticed something strange. There was no sound, not even the wind. It was eerily silent. No breeze, no distant bird calls, not even the scurrying of animals. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I continued, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I couldn't help feeling like something wasn't right. The trees seemed thicker now, their branches intertwining above me, casting long, dark shadows across the trail. I noticed the ground was uneven, rocks and roots sticking out of the earth like jagged teeth. I moved carefully, making sure not to trip. The trail was no longer a simple path. It was narrow and winding, sometimes disappearing into thick underbrush. The quiet was suffocating, and I began to feel the weight of isolation, as if the world had closed in around me. My breaths became shallow, my heart rate a little faster. I pushed on, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I had hiked much more difficult trails without ever feeling like this. Still, the air felt thick and heavy, and the silence was unsettling. I glanced behind me once or twice, but there was nothing, just the trail disappearing into the trees. At some point, I realized I had been walking for hours. The sun was no longer directly overhead. The shadows were lengthening, and I knew I had to find a place to rest before it got too dark. I wasn't planning to camp out here, but I decided to take a short break. I found a small clearing near a stream, the sound of water trickling over rocks, the first noise I had heard in what felt like forever. I sat down on a large rock, pulling out some snacks and trying to shake off the nervous energy that had settled in my chest. The air was cooler now, and the forest around me seemed even darker than before. The leaves rustled gently, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint snapping sound, like a branch breaking in the distance. I froze, listening. Nothing. I sighed, rubbing my temples, and stood up. I needed to keep moving. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, and I didn't want to be stuck out here in the dark. But as I gathered my things, I noticed something strange. The trail ahead, the one I had been following, didn't look right. It was as if the path had changed while I was sitting there. The direction was off. The trees that had lined the path before were gone, replaced by more underbrush and a tight thicket. I frowned, pulling out my map again. But when I looked down, I realized something even more disturbing. My map was different. The lines had blurred, as though the ink had run. I couldn't make out the landmarks I had memorized. My stomach twisted with unease. This wasn't just a mistake. Something was wrong. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. I should have turned back when I had the chance, but it was too late now. I didn't know which way to go. The trail that had been so clear just hours ago was now a maze of twisted branches and unfamiliar terrain. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I decided to retrace my steps, hoping I could find my way back to the clearing or maybe even a signpost. The further I walked, though, the more I realized the forest had changed again. The trees looked unfamiliar, their bark smoother, their leaves a different shade. I had been walking for what felt like hours, but I wasn't any closer to finding my way back. Night began to fall. The temperature dropped significantly, and I realized I was freezing. I had no light, no warmth, and no shelter. Panic set in. I could feel it rising in my chest like a wave. I had to get out of here. My mind raced as I tried to think of any other possible route, but everything seemed the same. There were no landmarks, no visible trail markers, just an endless sea of trees. My legs ached, and my body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop moving. I had no choice but to keep going. Every step felt heavier than the last, and I was losing all sense of time. The forest seemed to close in on me, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. Then something changed. I stumbled upon a small cabin. I don't know why I didn't notice it before, but there it was, nestled between two massive trees. It was old, its wood weathered and cracked, but it looked sturdy enough. My heart leapt with relief. Maybe I wasn't as lost as I thought. I approached cautiously, tapping on the door, though I didn't expect anyone to answer. There was no sound from inside, but the door creaked open when I pushed on it. Inside, it was dark, but the air was warm. I stepped inside, shivering from the cold, and I closed the door behind me. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace in one corner. It looked like no one had lived here for years, but it still felt safe. The fire was already lit, and though it was a strange thing to find in a supposedly abandoned cabin, I didn't question it. I just needed to rest. I sat by the fire, my body trembling from the cold and exhaustion. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that I was okay now. The fire crackled as the warmth spread through me, and slowly, I began to relax. The night outside was dark and silent, but I was no longer afraid. The forest had tried to confuse me, but it hadn't won. I had found shelter, and the worst of it was over. I wasn't sure how I had ended up here or why the trail had disappeared, but at that moment I didn't care. I had made it. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, the warmth of the fire keeping me safe. When I woke up, the morning light was just starting to filter through the trees. I packed up quickly, thankful to have made it through the night, and left the cabin behind. The trail was there, just as it had been before, leading me back toward the familiar. As I walked out of the woods and toward civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been playing tricks on me, but I was glad to be done with it. Whatever happened that day, it had taught me a valuable lesson. Nature is unpredictable, and the wild, no matter how beautiful, can turn dangerous when you least expect it. I finally made it back to the trailhead, breathing in the fresh mountain air. The sun was up, and the world felt normal again. I had made it through, and that's what mattered.